She stepped off the stagecoach with one crutch, one suitcase, and a letter that said only 4 words. I ain't pretty, sir. The wind was cold that day, the kind that carried dust and judgment in equal measure. Folks stared, whispered, and turned away. But the cowboy waiting at the gate, he didn't. He just removed his hat, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between two souls who'd both forgotten what hope felt like. No one knew then what that meeting would set in motion, or how fire, shame, and silence would all test the fragile thing they were about to build. If you believe courage and loyalty still matter in this world, join us by subscribing to Healing Stories of Hope. And wherever you are tonight, may kindness find you, even in the quietest corners of your heart. The first light of dawn spilled across the Wyoming plains, stretching like pale gold over miles of open land. The air was thin and sharp, touched with the smell of sagebrush and melting snow. The wind had that early spring bite, the kind that slid through cracks in the cabin walls and whispered through the chimney as if it carried messages from the mountains. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called, its cry fading into the silence of morning. Inside the cabin, a man sat at a rough-hewn table, a letter trembling between his fingers as though it weighed far more than paper should. Jace Harland was 45 and carried the kind of weariness that didn't come from age alone. His skin was the color of dusted copper, weathered by wind and sun. His jawline had once been strong, now softened by time and silence. A small scar ran from his left temple down to his cheek, faint, like a memory he didn't bother hiding. He wore a flannel shirt that had lost its color, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the fabric shiny where calloused hands had rested. The cabin behind him was sparse, one bed neatly made, a stove cold since last night's fire burned out, a single chair with a worn wool blanket draped over it. On the table lay the letter. The words had already burned themselves into his mind. I ain't pretty, sir, but I can cook. He had read them over and over until they no longer sounded like ink, but like a voice. A soft, uncertain voice that carried both apology and quiet strength. Beneath those words was her name, Anna Whitmore, a widow from Missouri, missing one leg and too many dreams. She had written to him for 3 months. 3 months of small talk that had turned into something deeper. Letters that started with weather and chores and ended with questions about regrets, laughter, and loneliness. The kettle on the stove hissed softly as he poured himself coffee, the sound small but steady. Steam rose into the dim air, curling like smoke, disappearing before it reached the ceiling. He took a sip, winced at the bitterness, and muttered, "Guess I'll find out if hope's still got a place in me." The words felt foreign in his mouth, almost foolish, yet the silence that followed seemed to agree. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint echo, the rhythmic beat of hooves approaching from far down the valley road. He turned toward the window. The glass was streaked with frost, blurring the wide world into shades of silver and brown. The land outside stretched endlessly, dotted with cattle like scattered shadows against snow-streaked hills. It was beautiful, yes, but in the way loneliness sometimes is. Too wide, too quiet, too unforgiving. 8 years he had lived here alone. 8 years since his wife, Margaret, had died while giving birth to their stillborn son. 8 years since sound had left this house. No laughter, no soft footfalls, no music save for the wind brushing the porch rail. He thought he'd grown used to it, but this morning, holding that letter, he realized he hadn't grown used to anything. He had just gone numb. Jace folded the letter carefully, the way men handle something sacred, His thumb brushed over her name again. He tried to picture her face, but couldn't. All he had were fragments from her words. A widow with a crutch, a garden behind a boarding house, a stray cat that followed her home from the market, a love for the smell of bread baking on rainy days. She'd written, "Some things don't heal right, Mr. Harland. The leg's one of them. The heart's another." He had stared at that line for hours the night it arrived. Maybe that was why he wrote back. Maybe that's why he hadn't stopped. The cabin creaked as he stood. His dog, a brown and white shepherd named Toby, raised its head from near the stove and blinked at him sleepily. "Easy, boy," Jace murmured, setting his mug down. "Stage'll be here soon." The dog yawned, stretched, and followed him to the door, nails tapping against the wood floor. When Jace opened the door, cold air rushed in, crisp and clean, smelling of thawing earth and pine sap. He stepped outside, boots sinking slightly into damp soil, and stared toward the horizon. The road from town cut like a scar through the land, winding between distant hills. Somewhere along that line of dust and sky, a stagecoach was coming. He tried to imagine the woman inside, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes darting between fear and determination. He imagined the way she might look at the world, half hopeful, half ready to turn back. And then he imagined her seeing him, a man she'd written to but never met, a man she might not recognize even if she tried. He ran a hand through his gray-flecked hair, exhaled slowly. For a moment, the thought of her turning around, leaving on the same coach that brought her, almost felt like mercy. He had failed at love once. What if it happened again? What if this time it broke something in her too? Behind him, the wind nudged the half-open door, making it creak softly. It sounded almost like Margaret's sigh, the one she used to give when she'd find him sitting up too late staring at the coals. For an instant, he saw her, barefoot by the stove, her hair unpinned, humming quietly to a child who never took a breath. He blinked hard, and the image faded back into the dust. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. In less than an hour, the stage would arrive. He would stand there among curious townsfolk, hat in hand, pretending he wasn't terrified. And then, a woman he had only known through ink would step down into his world, bringing with her the one thing he thought he'd buried: hope. He poured the last of his coffee into the sink, slipped on his weathered jacket, and took his hat from its peg by the door. Before stepping outside, he hesitated. The letter was still on the table, folded neat, her words facing up. He almost left it there. But something made him reach back, slide it into his breast pocket. A reminder of why he was doing this, or maybe of what he was risking. As he climbed into the wagon, the dog jumped beside him, tail thumping lightly. The reins felt cold in his hands. The road to town stretched long and pale beneath the morning sun. For the first time in years, Jace felt his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from something quieter, heavier. Anticipation. Halfway down the hill, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint clatter of wheels echoing between the rocks. He turned his head sharply. There it was, the stagecoach, a dark shape cresting the ridge, sunlight flashing off its brass fittings. His stomach tightened. He clicked his tongue, and the horse trotted faster. The closer he got, the louder the world seemed to grow. The hiss of wind through dry grass, the steady beat of hooves, the rattle of metal against wood. Yet beneath all that noise, his heart was painfully quiet. What if she looked at him and saw a man still haunted by another woman's ghost? What if he couldn't look at her without seeing what he'd lost? But the road didn't stop to ask questions, and neither did the coach. Dust rose in plumes as it drew nearer, and soon he could make out the driver's hat, the gleam of sunlight on the horses' bridles, the dark curtain fluttering in the window. He exhaled slowly, one hand tightening on the reins. "Well," he whispered, voice rough, "reckon we'll see if hope's still got a place in me." The wind didn't answer. It only carried the echo of his words across the empty fields, until the sound of approaching hooves swallowed them whole. And somewhere between the heartbeat of the horses and the sigh of the wind, the story began again. The stagecoach rumbled into Clearwater beneath the noon sun, wheels grinding against the dry dirt road, dust rising like smoke from an old fire. The town stirred at the sound, boots scuffing on the boardwalk, aprons flapping in the wind, a few curious faces peering from behind the saloon doors. Dogs barked, and a boy ran ahead of the coach shouting, "Stage from Missouri!" as though the news itself were worth gold. The horses slowed, their flanks glistening, and the driver cracked his whip once, sharp and proud. When the door opened, silence fell heavier than the dust. A woman stepped down slowly, one hand gripping the side rail, the other steadying a crutch polished smooth from years of use. Her right pant leg was neatly pinned beneath her traveling skirt, the hem dusted from the long miles. She wore a faded blue bonnet that shadowed her face, and a shawl of worn gray wool wrapped tight around her shoulders despite the warmth. Yet what caught the crowd's eye was not the crutch or the missing limb. It was her stillness. Anna Whitmore lifted her chin. Her face was ordinary in a way that could almost be missed, but her eyes, calm, steady, unflinching, carried a light that seemed to belong to someone who had survived more winters than most. There was no fear in her posture, only composure, as if she had long ago made peace with the way the world chose to look at her. The driver, a man with a whiskey-red nose and a kind smile, handed her a small satchel and muttered, "Take care now, ma'am." She nodded once, voice barely a whisper, "Thank you." Across the road, Jace Harlan stood beside his wagon, hat in hand. For a moment he didn't move. The light caught his eyes, gray-blue like the mountains beyond town, and something in him, the hardness that years had built, cracked just a little. Their gazes met, quiet but searching, like two travelers recognizing the same kind of loneliness in each other. Anna blinked first, breaking the spell. "You must be Mr. Harland," she said softly, her voice low and sure, with the hint of a Midwestern drawl. Jace nodded. "Yes, ma'am. And you must be the woman who can cook better than she can hope." For a second she said nothing. Then the corners of her lips curved in the smallest, most cautious smile. It was there and gone again, like sunlight between clouds. He took her satchel before she could protest, loading it onto the wagon. "It's not much of a ride," he murmured, "but it's quiet." "I've learned to like quiet," she replied, settling beside him. The crutch rested across her knees, her hands folded atop it neatly. As the horses started forward, neither spoke. The wheels rolled over the uneven road, the sound of metal and gravel filling the silence where words might have lived. From time to time, Jace glanced her way. Up close, he noticed the faint freckles along her cheeks, the hair that had escaped her bonnet, auburn streaks dulled by travel but still catching light when the sun hit right. Her hands were strong, the nails short and clean, her palms scarred from work, not vanity. She looked like someone who knew how to survive, and more importantly, how to keep her dignity intact while doing it. They passed the fields, the river glinting faintly to the east. Toby, the shepherd dog, trotted alongside the wagon, occasionally glancing up at the new passenger, as though sizing her up. Anna smiled faintly. "Good dog," she said. Her tone so gentle the animal's ears perked. Jace caught the sound of it, that soft, almost musical cadence, and looked away quickly, pretending to adjust the reins. By the time they reached the ranch, the afternoon had softened into gold. The hills around them shimmered with light, the long grass whispering against the wind. Anna turned her face toward it, breathing deeply as though she hadn't tasted open air in years. "Beautiful land," she murmured. "It's home," Jace replied simply. The cabin came into view. Rough, square, built for purpose rather than comfort. A few ranch hands looked up from the corral, curiosity plain on their faces. Men of dust and sunburned skin. They exchanged glances, elbowing one another when they saw the woman with the crutch. Jace cleared his throat, and that was enough. They turned back to their work. Inside, Anna paused just past the doorway. The air smelled of leather, pine sap, and solitude. "You live tidy," she said. "Old habit," he replied. "Never could stand clutter." She nodded, then asked quietly, "Do you mind if I make supper?" He blinked, taken aback. "You've been on the road near a week, ma'am. You should rest." "I'll rest after," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Cooking settles me. Always has." Before he could argue, she had already found her way to the small kitchen. Her movements were slow but precise, graceful even in limitation. The crutch leaned nearby as she moved about on one good leg, balancing with quiet skill. Soon, the air filled with the smell of simmering stew, beef, onions, herbs, the kind of smell that reminded Jace of a home that no longer existed. The hands drifted toward the porch, drawn by the scent. Tom Briggs, the foreman, a stocky man with a gray beard, sniffed the air and chuckled. "Smells like a Sunday I can believe in," he murmured. Others nodded, waiting near the doorway with shy anticipation. Inside, Jace leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching her. She didn't hum, didn't talk, but her face softened as she worked, as if each stir of the pot eased something inside her. He noticed the small tremor in her fingers when she thought no one was looking. When he spoke, it was almost in a whisper. "You've done this before." She didn't glance up. "Cooking?" "No. Walking into someone else's life like you belong there." A pause. Then quietly, "You learn to, or you don't, survive." The bread came out last, warm, soft, golden. When she finally sat down, she seemed to shrink a little, exhaustion catching up with her. Jace set a bowl in front of her, but she shook her head. "You first." He obliged, spooning a mouthful, and froze. The flavor hit him hard. Not just the richness, but the memory it carried. It tasted like a time when laughter still lived in this house. One by one, the ranch hands joined, passing plates, murmuring thanks. No one spoke much after that. There was something sacred about the silence, about the way the meal drew them together. Even Toby lay quietly under the table, head on his paws, eyes half closed. Anna watched them all, her gaze moving from face to face, taking in every detail. When she finally lifted her spoon, it wasn't pride in her eyes. It was relief. A quiet sigh, as though she had proven, at least for tonight, that she deserved her place at the table. Outside, dusk settled over the land. The windows glowed faintly with lamplight, the hills beyond fading into shadow. For the first time in 8 years, Jace's house sounded alive. Spoons against bowls, low laughter, a dog's contented sigh. When the meal ended, Anna rose carefully, steadying herself on her crutch. "Thank you for supper," Jace said softly. She looked at him with tired eyes but a faint smile. "You're welcome, Mr. Harland. Thank you for letting me." Later, when the fire had burned low and the house fell quiet again, Jace lingered by the doorway. From down the hall, he heard the soft thump of her crutch against the floorboards. Steady, deliberate, almost like a heartbeat returning to a long, silent home. Sunday came with the kind of sunlight that made the dust shimmer like gold. The air was dry, wind curling through the narrow streets of Clearwater, lifting skirts and stirring gossip. Church bells rang from the small white steeple at the heart of town, a sound meant to gather faith, but more often than not, it gathered curiosity. By mid-morning, the townsfolk filled the church square. Women in pressed calico dresses and men in stiff Sunday coats, their voices lilting with the rhythm of habit and rumor. Anna Whitmore stood by the food table near the oak trees, a soft breeze catching the ends of her gray shawl. She had brought a basket covered neatly with a cloth embroidered in fading thread, and when she lifted it, the air filled with the scent of rosemary and slow-cooked beef. The smell was rich, comforting, the kind that quieted stomachs and tongues alike. For a few moments, even the talkative women from the mercantile fell silent, breathing in the warmth she had carried all the way from Jace Harlan's kitchen. Jace arrived a few steps behind her, hat in hand, his Sunday shirt pressed, though his collar looked uncomfortable against the heat. He nodded to a few familiar faces, received polite half-smiles in return. There was curiosity in every gaze that met his, the kind that sits between admiration and judgment. Clearwater had never been cruel outright. It was too small for open meanness. But cruelty doesn't always need a loud voice. Sometimes it just hums softly between whispered words. At first, it was admiration disguised as surprise. "She cooked that?" someone muttered. "Smells fit for a wedding feast." Another chimed in. "Maybe she's making up for what she lacks elsewhere." The laughter was muffled, polite, the kind that stings worse for its softness. Jace heard only fragments, drifting like ashes from a fire he thought long dead. Anna moved through the crowd with quiet grace, refilling plates, smiling gently at compliments, never once flinching. Her hair had been tied back in a simple knot, a few strands catching sunlight. Her face flushed faintly from the heat of the day. There was nothing loud about her, no bright color, no attempt to demand space, and yet she carried a kind of poise that made even silence look deliberate. When the pastor's wife, Mrs. Eudora Hale, approached, she wore that expression particular to women who believe kindness is a form of charity. 60, tall and stately in her lavender dress, her silver brooch gleamed like an unblinking eye. "You must be Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her smile wide enough to show every tooth. "We've heard so much about you." Anna inclined her head. "All good things, I hope." "Of course," Mrs. Hale replied, voice honeyed, though folks were a touch surprised Mr. Harlan didn't choose someone local. Jace stepped closer then, his tone even. "Sometimes the best things don't come from nearby." Mrs. Hale blinked, her smile stiffening, and drifted away with a polite laugh. By the time the church social reached its peak, the table of food was nearly empty. The stew was gone, the bread reduced to crumbs. Children played tag between benches, men swapped talk of cattle, and the women, the ones who had been watching Anna since she stepped off the coach, huddled near the lemonade stand, their voices sharp beneath the laughter. "Poor man. She's not much to look at. At least she can work. She must have caught him at his loneliest." The words hit Jace like stones thrown from behind a curtain. He froze, hands tightening around the cup he held, knuckles pale against the tin. The sound of their laughter, light, careless, scraped against something raw inside him. He wanted to speak, to tell them that Anna was worth more than all their painted smiles and polished shoes, that she'd walked through more fire than they'd ever known. But he didn't. He stood there, jaw locked, and said nothing. Anna turned at that moment, catching his expression before he could hide it. Her eyes lingered on him, searching, uncertain, and then she looked away. A flush crept into her cheeks, though whether from shame or hurt, he couldn't tell. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. She kept her distance, her movements quieter still, her smile careful, rehearsed. When they finally left, the road back to the ranch felt longer than usual. The silence between them was heavy, not angry, just hollow, like a bridge that no longer knew what it was holding up. Toby ran ahead, tail down, ears twitching at every gust of wind. Even the land seemed subdued, as though aware that something delicate had fractured. That night, the ranch was filled with the soft sounds of supper being prepared. Anna moved about the kitchen with the same calm precision, her crutch thumping gently against the wood floor. The stew simmered, the bread baked, and the air was once again full of warmth, but none of it reached her face. Her laughter, the quiet kind that used to rise unexpectedly, was gone. Jace watched from the doorway. He wanted to say her name, to break the silence he had built with his own fear. But every time he opened his mouth, the words turned to dust. When she finally sat down to eat, she looked at him, offered a polite smile, and said only, "There's more bread if you want." He nodded, unable to answer. The night outside turned restless. The wind began to howl through the barn rafters, rattling loose boards and stirring the horses. Their hooves struck the floor with a nervous rhythm, echoing through the cold air. Toby barked once, then fell quiet, ears flattened. Jace stepped to the window, watching the storm roll over the plains, a ghostly sea of gray and white under the moonlight. Behind him, Anna rose, collected the dishes, and began to wash them one by one, her movements slow, deliberate. He turned toward her, ready at last to speak, to apologize, to tell her he'd heard the cruelty and hated himself for not stopping it. But she didn't look up. Her shoulders were steady, her face unreadable. He stood there for a long while, trapped between pride and regret. Outside, the wind screamed again, carrying the scent of rain and something else. A warning, perhaps. Somewhere in the dark, a wagon creaked far off down the valley road, its sound faint but distinct. Jace didn't hear it over the storm, but by the next sunrise, that sound, that faint, approaching wheel, would matter more than words ever could. The morning came pale and windless, the kind of day that made even the mountains seem unsure of themselves. The cattle grazed lazily near the fence line, the air heavy with the promise of rain that never quite came. From the porch, Jace Harland watched the horizon, his coffee cooling in his hand. Anna was down by the garden, kneeling on one leg, her crutch resting nearby as she trimmed the last of the sage for drying. She moved slower these days, not from pain, but from something else, something quiet and inward, as though her spirit had been walking through fog no one else could see. The sound reached them before the sight, a low creak of wheels, the sharp rhythm of hooves cutting across the ridge road. Toby barked once, tail stiff, his gaze fixed on the black carriage descending the hill. It was the kind of vehicle that didn't belong in Clearwater, polished wood gleaming even through dust, brass fittings catching the dull light, curtains drawn tight. Whoever it carried, they weren't here for neighborly talk. The carriage came to a stop near the fence, the driver, a tall man in a top hat, jumping down to open the door. From within stepped a woman dressed in dark silk, her figure slim and commanding. Her gloved hands adjusted the folds of her dress as she surveyed the ranch. Her eyes sharp, calculating, the kind that didn't see people, only their worth. Her hair, silver blonde and coiled high, caught the wind just enough to gleam like a blade. She smiled when she saw Anna, but it wasn't the sort of smile one gives in greeting. It was the smile of someone who already knew she held the upper hand. "Mrs. Whitmore," the woman called, her voice carrying clear across the open yard. Then, with a tilt of her head, "Or should I say, Miss Anna from the kitchen in St. Louis." The words struck the air like a whip. Anna froze mid-motion, the handful of sage leaves spilling from her grasp. For a long moment, she didn't turn. Her shoulders straightened, but her eyes, when she finally faced the woman, were wide and unguarded, like someone remembering a wound that never healed. Jace set his cup down and stepped off the porch. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone measured, polite in the way that hinted at warning. The woman didn't answer him. She looked only at Anna, and there was something cruelly satisfied in her stillness. "I heard a rumor," she said smoothly, "that one of my former girls had made quite a life for herself out west. I didn't believe it, of course. A cook from my home playing lady of the ranch. It sounded almost comical." Her name surfaced like a curse. Mrs. Aldridge, widow of a wealthy banker from St. Louis, a woman known for her taste in silk, scandal, and servants who didn't speak back. She was nearing 60, though her painted lips and sharp cheekbones pretended otherwise. The townsfolk had begun to gather at the fence, ranch hands, passers-by, even the postmaster who'd come to deliver the mail. Mrs. Aldridge's gaze flicked toward them, then back to Anna, and her voice rose just enough to carry. "You see," she said, "Anna here used to cook in my kitchen. My son, foolish boy that he was, took a liking to her. Imagine that. A servant girl, a cripple, thinking she belonged in our world." A ripple went through the onlookers, some murmuring, some frowning. Jace's jaw tightened, but the woman went on. "We gave her every kindness, of course. Let her stay until she understood her place. But she forgot herself. She thought she could be seen, thought she could be loved." The last word was almost spat, a blend of mockery and venom. Anna didn't speak. She stood as if the ground beneath her had turned fragile, as if any movement might break it. Her face had gone pale beneath the sun, her lips pressed tight. When she did speak, her voice was barely more than breath. "That's enough." Mrs. Aldridge laughed lightly. "Enough? Oh, my dear, truth doesn't end when you say it does. I only came to remind you who you are, before you start playing housewife out here in the wilderness." Jace stepped forward then, his boots crunching over the gravel. "You've said enough, ma'am." She turned her attention to him for the first time, her eyes cool and appraising. "Shouldn't your wife's past concern you, Mr. Harland? Or do you prefer not to know what kind of woman you've brought into your home?" He didn't raise his voice. His words came low, steady, each one deliberate. "Her past built her strength," he said. "Yours built your shame." He nodded toward the carriage. "Now get off my land!" For a moment, Mrs. Aldridge's face faltered, her painted smile cracking at the edges. The driver, sensing the shift, moved quickly to open the carriage door. She hesitated only long enough to glance once more at Anna, her gaze heavy with disdain. "You'll never outrun what you are," she said softly, then stepped inside. The carriage turned, wheels grinding, and within moments it was nothing but a black shadow swallowed by the dust. Silence fell across the yard. The onlookers, unsure of what to do with the quiet, drifted away one by one, heads bowed. Toby barked once, sharp, anxious, then trotted to Anna's side, pressing his nose against her hand. She didn't move. The sage she'd dropped lay scattered at her feet, green against the dry earth. Jace approached slowly. "Anna," he said, his voice roughened by restraint. She didn't look at him. He wanted to reach for her hand, to tell her that nothing that woman said mattered. But the look on Anna's face stopped him cold. Her eyes were hollow, her expression far away, as though she'd been pulled back into a memory too painful to leave. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled not with anger, but with something smaller, more devastating. "She's right about one thing," she whispered. "You can't outrun what you are." Jace shook his head. "You're not what she said you are." But she was already turning away, her crutch biting into the dirt as she made her slow path toward the cabin. The door closed behind her with a sound that felt too final. That night, her lamp burned long past midnight. Through the thin curtains, Jace could see the flicker of light from the porch. Steady, sleepless, haunted. He sat outside for a long while, listening to the wind move through the grass, the slow rhythm of the horses in the barn, the distant thunder crawling across the hills. He wanted to believe the worst had passed, that the storm had already broken. But the silence inside the house told another story. One not of anger, but of something deeper. The quiet ache of a woman who didn't mourn what had happened, but what she still believed she deserved. And as the night stretched long, Jace wondered if he'd just lost her, not to that woman's cruelty, but to ghosts he couldn't see. The storm came without mercy. It began as a low growl rolling down from the mountains, then turned into a roar that shook the valley. The wind tore through the pasture, bending the tall grass flat, scattering tools across the yard. Jace Harland was on the porch when the first flash of lightning cracked open the sky, so bright it carved the world into two halves, before and after. He could smell the coming rain before he heard it, that sharp scent of dust and ozone that made horses restless and men uneasy. Then came the shout. A man's voice, raw, desperate, slicing through the storm from the direction of the barn. Jace didn't think, didn't grab a coat, didn't call for help. He bolted across the yard, boots hammering the wet earth, rain already driving into his face like needles. The air was thick with smoke before he reached the gates. The barn was burning, fast and furious, its roof alive with flame, timbers cracking like gunfire. "Tom!" he shouted. "Where are you?" A faint answer came from inside, muffled and panicked. One of the ranch hands, trapped near the back stalls. Jace yanked his bandana up over his mouth and plunged into the smoke. The heat hit him like a wall. Horses screamed in terror, kicking at their stalls. Flames leapt from beam to beam, chasing oxygen like a living thing. He grabbed a pitchfork, rammed it into the latch, but the metal was red hot, searing his hands. He cursed, kicked the door once, twice. Then from outside, he heard it. A sound that didn't belong, the thud-thud of wood striking mud. He turned and through the sheets of rain saw her, Anna Whitmore, hobbling fast across the yard, crutch sinking deep into the muck, one arm dragging a bucket sloshing water with every uneven step. Her shawl was gone, Her hair plastered to her face, and her eyes, those steady, quiet eyes, were burning with something fiercer than the fire itself. "Anna," he yelled, "get back." But she didn't. She moved closer, the rain soaking her skirts, the crutch slipping but never falling. She reached him, thrust the bucket forward, and said through the storm, "If you're going in, you'll need more than courage." Together, they heaved the bucket at the doorway, the steam rising as water met flame. The fire hissed, but refused to die. Jace kicked at the broken stall door again, the wood splintering under his boot. Anna limped inside after him, covering her mouth with her sleeve. "Over here," came Tom's voice again, hoarse, terrified. They found him crouched near a half-collapsed beam, his leg pinned under debris, eyes wild with smoke. Jace lifted the beam with a grunt, his arms trembling from strain. Anna dropped her crutch, wedged herself against the opposite side, pushing with all the strength left in her single leg, her jaw clenched, her face slick with sweat and ash. The beam shifted. Tom scrambled free, coughing violently. "Go!" Jace barked. "Get outside, now!" They stumbled through the choking haze, fire chasing them as if unwilling to let them leave. Behind them, a horse broke through its stall, eyes rolling white in terror. Anna turned instinctively toward it, reaching a hand as though she could calm it with her voice. "Go!" Jace grabbed her arm, dragging her out just as the roof gave way. The barn collapsed in a shower of sparks and smoke, flames shooting upward into the rain. For a moment, it seemed the whole sky was burning. They stood in the downpour, trembling, soaked through, mud clinging to their boots. Tom had fallen to his knees nearby, coughing but alive. Jace reached for Anna's shoulder. She looked up at him, face streaked with ash, one sleeve torn, and whispered, "You should have let me stay back." He shook his head, breath still ragged. And miss watching courage outshine fire? The rain answered for them both, falling harder, hissing as it met the last of the burning wood. By morning, the storm was gone, leaving behind a silence too fragile to touch. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth. Ash coated the fields like gray snow. Toby nosed through the wreckage, whining softly as if mourning the loss of the old barn that had sheltered generations of horses. Jace was already at work by sunrise, hammer in hand, repairing the fence where the fire had jumped the posts. His shirt was half-buttoned, his arms blackened with soot. The lines of exhaustion on his face looked carved there by time itself. Anna approached quietly, her crutch sinking into the soft ground, her skirt still damp from the night before. She stopped a few feet away. "You should rest," she said. He didn't look up right away. "Can't," he murmured. "Too much to fix." Her gaze fell on the ashes that used to be the barn, the way the smoke still rose faintly from the ruins. "We saved him," she said softly. "Yeah," he replied, still working. "You did." She blinked, taken aback. "We did, Jace." He paused then, leaned on the post, finally looking at her. There was something new in his eyes, something raw, unguarded. "You keep saying you ain't pretty, Anna," he said quietly. "But I've seen beauty survive flames. It looks a lot like you." For a moment, she couldn't speak. The wind lifted a strand of hair across her face, and he reached out instinctively to tuck it behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheek, gentle, reverent. In that small touch, something shifted between them, something neither dared to name, but both understood. Anna looked toward the sunrise. The sky was pale gold now, the color of second chances. She drew a shaky breath, her hand tightening around the crutch, the weight of old shame beginning, at last, to ease. She had spent so long believing that her scars made her less. But last night, in the rain and the fire, she'd seen herself through his eyes, not as broken, but as burning bright. Behind them, the horses stirred in the corral, snorting softly, waiting for feed. Life, as it always did, was already moving forward, and as Jace turned back to his work, he felt the faintest smile ghost across his lips. Maybe this wasn't redemption for the things either of them had lost, but it was something close, something earned. By the time spring had turned to summer, the valley around Clearwater no longer smelled of ash. Wildflowers crept through the scorched soil, bright and stubborn, and the grass grew high enough to brush against the bellies of grazing horses. The fences stood straight again, every post replaced by Jace's steady hands, every plank bearing the mark of quiet renewal. The ranch, once silent and scarred, began to breathe again, not with the rush of work alone, but with laughter, with life, with something that sounded a lot like grace finding its way back. Anna Whitmore's kitchen became its own kind of sanctuary. The scent of fresh bread drifted down the dirt road, mingling with the sound of wind and church bells. Folks from town started showing up more often. A widow with her youngest boy, an old trapper missing 2 fingers, even the preacher's wife with her shy daughter, all drawn by the promise of warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. Anna welcomed them in, her apron dusted with flour, her hair tied back, her crutch leaning nearby but often forgotten as she moved with calm, practiced grace. She made room for everyone, a place at the table, a story to tell, a bowl of stew deep enough for hope to sit in it. Whispers, once sharp as thorns, began to fade. People stopped calling her "that poor woman" and started saying Mrs. Harlan's got the best bread west of the river. They spoke of her hands, steady, capable, kind, and of the way her laughter could turn even a hard day soft. The ranch hands who once kept their distance now tipped their hats and lingered near the porch after meals, helping with repairs or bringing wildflowers from the meadow. It wasn't charity they offered her anymore. It was respect. Jace saw it all in quiet pride. He worked long hours in the field, the sun carving new lines into his weathered face, his shirt clinging to his shoulders with sweat. But whenever he looked toward the house and saw her through the window, flower-dusted, humming to herself, a streak of sunlight warming her cheek, something in him settled, like the world had finally found its right shape. One evening, near harvest, Jace began building a new porch. He didn't tell her why. Said it was just something the house needed. But every nail he drove carried meaning he didn't have words for. The boards were sanded smooth, the steps wide enough for her to walk without fear. Along the railing, he carved tiny hearts. No pattern, no symmetry. Just one for each day he'd learned to love her a little more. When it was finished, he stood back and looked at it the way a man looks at a miracle he built with his own 2 hands. Anna came out to see it, her eyes widening in that quiet, wondering way of hers. "You did all this for me?" she asked. Jace shrugged, wiping sawdust from his hands. "For us," he said simply. That night the town gathered for the harvest celebration. The air smelled of hay and roasted corn. Fiddles played beneath the soft glow of lanterns strung between trees. Anna's stew simmered in a great iron pot by the fire, feeding more mouths than anyone could count. Children ran barefoot through the grass, chasing each other with ribbons of wheat. And through it all, Jace kept catching glimpses of her, laughing with neighbors, handing out bread, the hem of her skirt brushing against the lantern light like it belonged there. Later, when the music quieted and the people drifted home, Jace and Anna sat on the new porch steps, watching the last streaks of gold fade into the valley. The sun was melting into the horizon, painting everything in a warm, forgiving glow. A breeze stirred the wheat, carrying the hum of distant crickets and the faint echo of laughter still floating from town. Anna leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, the day's tiredness softened by peace. "Do you ever regret?" she asked softly. Jace's hand covered hers. He looked out at the fading light for a long time before answering. "Only the years I spent not seeing what mattered," he said. His voice was steady, low, the kind that came from a man who had finally stopped running from the weight of his own heart. For a moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, the horses in the corral standing still, the wind brushing through the tall grass like a lullaby. Then Anna laughed quietly, and he joined her, their voices mingling with the evening air, carried far across the fields. It wasn't loud, that laughter, just enough to remind the valley that love, once broken, could still be heard. The sky deepened from gold to rose, from rose to blue, until the first stars began to bloom. A lantern glowed faintly behind them through the window, the same window that once looked out on loneliness, now bright with warmth. Beside the porch rail, Anna's crutch leaned forgotten, its shadow long and soft against the wood. Jace noticed it, but didn't mention it. He simply watched her, the woman who had walked through shame and fire, who had built beauty out of nothing but faith and will, and thought how strange it was that the hardest journeys sometimes end not with trumpets or glory, but with silence, with peace, with two hands resting together on a porch at sunset. And as the night folded around them, the valley breathed in harmony again. Wind, laughter, heartbeats, all keeping time to the same gentle rhythm. There are moments in life when healing doesn't arrive with grand gestures or second chances. It comes quietly, like sunlight finding its way through broken shutters. Maybe that's what love really is. Not the absence of scars, but the grace to live gently with them. We all carry something. Old fears, lost dreams, the weight of what we thought we'd never overcome. But sometimes, it only takes one act of kindness, one shared silence, to remind us that beauty can still grow from what's been burned. If you've ever found yourself rebuilding after the storm, or learning to love again when you thought it was too late, then you already understand the heart of this story. It's about hope that doesn't shout. It simply stays. Thank you for spending this moment with us. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Because somewhere out there, another quiet miracle is waiting to be told.